Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week it's time to get the frog going under its own power. It's time to get the electronics up and running. There's not too much to do. What takes the time is making it neat and tidy. For the receiver, we've got a 3-channel FlySky. It's a lot smaller than the Tamiya radio in the manual, so we should be able to tuck it away somewhere out of sight. The kit comes with a nice TBLE02 ESC, which would work just fine, but it seems a bit of a shame to use a censored brushless ESC in a model that's only ever going to be run brushed. Instead, I'm going to fit this one that came out of our FTX Outlaw. It's got forward, reverse and brake, and has a nice little beck built in, and should happily handle the stock Tamiya motor, and most likely a fair bit more. I think the basic layout is going to have the ESC stuck down to the 8-shaped brace at the bottom of the chassis. It'll be good for routing the wires, and it'll get plenty of air when we're hooning around. Something I'm not really happy about is the Tamiya motor. It just doesn't really look very nice, and the wires hanging out at the end are going to be a pain to hide. Instead, I'm going to swap it for this old Speed Gems 2 19 turn. It might be a little bit hot for the frog gearbox, so we'll probably have to source a ball diff if it starts slipping. But it should be fun all the same. Swapping the motor is just a case of removing the stock one. It's just the 2 screws and then it slides out. Now we swap the Tamiya insulation spacer widget over. The new motor's ball raced, so the housing is a little bit smaller than the Tamiya motor. The spacer will work just fine, it's just a bit more fiddly to get it all lined up. The pinion goes on with the same 16.5mm from the spacer to the top of the pinion. Now I've actually got a brass pinion ready to swap as I'm editing the video, so we'll do that when we do some of the other mods and upgrades. Now the motor offers up to the gearbox and the 2 screws go in. Couldn't really be easier. And there's no mesh to worry about, so yeah, nice and simple. Next we need to connect the motor up to the ESC, or at least fit the wires that go into the chassis. Because we've got an open end bell motor now, we can make it extra neat and tidy. There's no need for the wires to hang out the side. We can run them back under the motor. We'll need to flip the chassis over and remove a wheel so we've got good access to the motor. We could solder up the motor off the chassis, but it's easier to visualize where the wires want to go when it's in place. We need a little bit of flux on the stripped end of the wire so we can tin it with some fresh solder. Now we can have another little dip in the flux and solder the wire to one of the terminals on the motor. I pulled the motor from a clodbuster, so it's already got some healthy solder on the terminals, otherwise you'd need to tin them too. Now, instead of running the wires out of the end of the motor, we're going to run them back under the motor, something you really can't do with a stock setup. The wire then happily runs through the gap in the back of the chassis to where the ESC is going to live. The other wire is exactly the same, we just solder it to the other terminal and run it under the motor. Now I might fiddle with the setup a little bit off camera, but that's the gist of it. When the body goes back on, it should look rather good. With that done, we can pop the wheel back on and see about fitting the ESC. For access, it's going to be a lot easier if we remove the front aluminium bar. It's got a screw in each side, we just remove them and the bar lifts out. Now we're not going to do anything fancy with the ESC, but we do need to get it into a position that has the wires coming out in a sensible direction, and so the switch is going to reach somewhere that we'll be able to get at it. When we found a good spot, we'll use some servo tape to stick it down to the 8-shaped crossmember. Ideally, we'd also use a bit of 99% IPA to clean everything up, but it's in short supply as I'm building the buggy, so we'll just have to hope it's clean enough. Stick some tape to the ESC, peel off the backing, then lower it down into the chassis and firmly stick it down. Next we need to hook up the ESC to the motor. Now you could use bullet connectors, but for this install I'm just going to solder the wires together. There's not exactly a vast amount of free space, and the solder joints will just be a little bit easier to tuck out of the way. When the body's on, we can flip the chassis over and start splicing. Without the body on, you're going to be resting the buggy on the driver's head, which probably wouldn't be a good idea. Because it's a bit fiddly to film, I'm just going to cut to them already being soldered up. I did try and film it, but my hands were in the way 90% of the time. It's literally just a couple of simple wire-to-wire joints with a nice bit of heat shrink, nothing too amazing. We can now tuck those joints up in the chassis out of the way, because the rails are hollow, they stay put perfectly. Receiver next, and all we need to do is plug the steering servo into channel 1 and the ESC into channel 2. Other than binding it, it should work without any fiddling. To bind, we just need to hold the button down on the receiver and power the buggy up with the battery. And we need to hold the bind button on the transmitter and turn it on. All being well, they should bind, but I usually find it's a bit hit or miss with the FlySky radios. I have much better luck using a bind plug on channel 3. I think it's just a case of it being a bit tricky to get the button pressed while doing everything else, so it doesn't always go into bind mode. With the bind plug, you really can't go wrong. After turning the buggy and transmitter off and on again, it should all be working. You might have to reverse the steering channel if the steering's working backwards, but that's just a switch to flip on a basic radio or a menu item on a computer radio. All simple stuff. There's not much left to do now. We need to very carefully tidy away the servo leads. We don't really want them to find their way out of the chassis and get hung up on a passing rock. Remember, there's going to be lots of shaking and vibration, so the leads need to be fairly secure. There's a little bit of a pocket in front of the steering servo that we can use to keep the wires safe. We can poke most of them in there before fitting. When we stick the receiver to the side of the servo, it'll trap the wires quite nicely. As usual, we'll need a square of servo tape to stick the receiver in place. If you plan a little bit, you can position it so you can still get to the bind button and the channel 3 connector to use a bind plug. So if we ever want to change transmitters, we don't have to take anything apart. There isn't really anything special to mount the switch, so we just stick it down to the chassis so it'll sit just under the edge of the body. It'll be out of the way, but still easy to get at between activity. Next, we have the aluminium bar that goes back in with the 2 screws. There's not much to say about it really, you just offer it up and do up the screws. And that leaves the antenna, and to be honest, you could probably get away with just tucking it up in the chassis somewhere. Range would be adequate, but just like the servo leads, you do run the risk of getting it caught up somewhere. It's better to use a bit of antenna tube to keep it safe. Best would be to get the active bit at the end up above everything, but you still get more than enough range with the antenna laid flat under the body. So we're just going to zip tie a tube to the top of the chassis. It'll keep it nice and safe, but won't be visible with the body on. A good compromise. So that's the electronics install complete. We can put the body back on now and see what batteries fit. As mentioned during the build, you can space off the end stops for the battery to get a bit more space. So unlike a lot of other older Tamiyas, the kit is almost universal. My only real suggestion is, if you're going to use a LiPo, make sure it's a hard case pack. It's going to be a bit vulnerable in a crash, so it needs the extra protection. If we try a good old 6L Nimai, it fits with lots of space to spare, but that's not really surprising. A round LiPo almost fits, but it's just slightly too long, a good candidate for spacing off the end stops. What surprised me a little bit was these square LiPo 2S packs are an absolute perfect fit. There's just a little bit of clearance by the end stops, and they fill the gap in the chassis perfectly. Even when the door gets closed, they're just about perfect, almost like Tamiya designed the chassis just for them. The only downside is the rather large leads on the battery pack are a bit of a pain to hide away. They're really meant for a much higher power RC, but it should work. We can push most of the leads back into the chassis. So there we go then, there's our frog ready to run. Next I'll put some footage up of the buggy out and about, a little bit of dry dirt and a grassy field, nothing exciting yet. I really want to change the rear tyres to something a bit easier to replace before really leaning on it. From the quick test, the buggy is a lot more nimble than I would have expected, but you can definitely tell it's a bit of a porker. The weight really makes it push into the turns. The extra power from the 19-turn motor can cure that with some extra throttle though. It does skids for days. Great fun. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there and leave the outside footage running. So, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!